Welcome to Reasonable Faith, everybody. We're so glad that you're here. A couple of announcements. One, tomorrow is our this weekend is our San Marcos trip. So Alan is going to be talking at the Unapologetic Conference in San Marcos. And tomorrow,
one of many speakers, and definitely not the lead speakers. You might want to clarify that.
But the most important one.
Important to us, right? I say that, I'm not going. Anyway,
What?
I know. I know. Anyway, point is, yes, Greta?
If anybody wants to make last minute plans to come, I think we still have room in my van.
There's now one more.
There's now one more space.
One more space than there was
because of me.
before.
But thank you for that.
I'm not guilting you.
I feel so guilted right now. But anyway,
Live on
Not
the
my
internet.
problem.
live on the internet. But okay, so yeah, just like message Greta and y'all can take you. The conference, by the way, is 100% free, and you'd like have everything you would need. So like, if you want to make the weekend trip, definitely get in touch with Greta, and we'll figure something out. Other news. March 4th next week, aka next Saturday, is Pancakes Pontification. Keep that on your calendars. Invite people, let them know, that kind of thing. I think that's it for announcements. Alan, would you like to come up and introduce the speaker?
Sure, yeah. So some of y'all have met Adam. He's talked before in a kind of a brief segment to the group, but just in case you don't know him, this is Dr. Adam Broussard. He has a PhD from Rutgers in astrophysics. So that's a pretty significant accomplishment, and we're really glad to have him speaking to the group today. And I've known him and his family for a long time, and he's real good friends, is good friends with my son. So great guy. I've seen his slides here. I think you'll really enjoy this. So we're getting a late start. Let's go ahead and turn it over and let you get started.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna pull up my notes really quick. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. So I'm really excited to be here. We're going to take kind of a deep dive look at Genesis and cosmology. So this is going to have a shocking amount of history probably for the astronomy that you expected. But I promise there will be astronomy at the end. So that's my thing that keeps you here, so you don't leave early. All right, so first of all, who am I? I am, as Alan introduced me, I went to Rutgers for my PhD in astrophysics. I went to Texas A&M for my undergrad in physics. Whoop. And then my interests are Laika the space dog. I actually meant to put a picture in here and I forgot to, so you're just gonna have to imagine the cutest dog possible there. I love tabletop RPGs. I like backyard astronomy, not to be confused with professional astronomy. That's amateur astronomy, so I'm both amateur and professional. And I like bridging the connection between science and the church. So hopefully this talk gives you some ammunition to do that. When it comes to research in astronomy, there's lots of different topics that I've listed out here. These at the top are me. So my research focused on cosmology and galaxy formation and evolution. It was really more, my research was kind of tangential to cosmology, so I would not really call myself a cosmologist, but I will do my best to summarize cosmology for you today. And you can see lots of other topics here, like galaxy formation and evolution is all about how galaxies form their stars and assemble them over time, how stars are, how light is received from galaxies as it passes through dust and gas and things like that. You've got the Milky Way and Local Group, those are the specific galaxies around us. Exoplanets, that's planets around other stars. Stellar physics, how do stars work? Supernovae, how do stars die? Cosmological simulations, that's simulations of the universe, which is pretty fun, use lots of those. And then active galactic nuclei, these are big black holes at the centers of galaxies. So lots of really cool, these are just, this is a sampler of different topics in research, but I focus on these top two mostly.
The really big stuff.
Yeah.
If it's not huge.
The really big stuff, yeah. In more ways than one. So the first question is, what is the big deal with biblical cosmology? So you may have heard someone say before something like, well, doesn't the Bible just have a restatement of these other stories that we see in older texts? Things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? It has things in it like how the gods want to destroy humanity and they send a flood, but one of the gods warns one of the humans that a flood is coming, and so he builds an ark. It houses his family and animals, and then he sends birds out to see if the floodwaters have receded. This was written really, really long time ago, like before the time of Moses, long time ago. So, so this is something that bothered me somewhat, especially before I kind of learned I think a better way to read Genesis. But this can be a little bit disturbing, right? That it looks like all of these themes existed before the Bible did, right? And then in Egyptian and Babylonian and Sumerian creation stories, you have things like a watery beginning, themes like splitting the water below from the water above to make the seas and the sky. It has flood imagery as well, and they have evil serpents and snakes specifically, right? In these creation stories. What gives, right? So we're going to take a look at all of these to see why that is the case and what's really being talked about when we talk about biblical cosmology. All right, so first of all, though, we need to talk about reading ancient texts as inside jokes. So my wife and I have an inside joke where we will, especially when eating food, we'll say the exact opposite of what we intend, which is something like, we'll be eating something and I'll say, oh, that's terrible. You won't want any of that. Give me all of your food, right? And so that's an inside joke that we have, which can get us in a little bit of trouble sometimes because as we had dinner with a friend last night, I was having pizza and she said, does it taste good? And I said, it's okay, I guess. And she was like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, no, that means it's actually really good. But the point is that the whole purpose of inside jokes is that you really need the context to be able to understand the joke. Oops. And so in particular, one of the oldest so-and-so walks into a bar jokes in recorded history is about 4,000 years old from Sumer. And it goes, a dog walks into a tavern and says, I can't see anything. I'll open this one. And nobody's laughing, not even pity laughs. So as you can see, this is a joke that made total sense to people in Sumer, and it makes no sense to us today. But I like to think that it has something to do with like this pug here. Somehow, I don't know, this is just an image that I thought of when I thought of a dog not being able to see something. This is not Leica, by the way. So
all humor will be randomly generated.
There you go, yeah. The terrible humor will continue until morale improves. So
2 plus 2 equals weed eater.
So the whole point is that with these ancient texts, we're not actually going to be able to understand what they're saying without context, right? If you don't have context, it's not going to make sense. So just like an inside joke from 4,000 years ago, Sumeria. All right, so now we can actually get started with Genesis. So this is Genesis 1 and 2. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was a formless and desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And so the context for this verse, or this pair of verses, is going to be extremely important, and that's what we're going to talk about for like the next 20 slides. So buckle up. All right, so let's talk about Genesis in general as we kind of step into this. So what's the deal with Genesis? Genesis sets up the whole narrative for the Bible, right? It's the foundation on which the Bible is laid because it's the very first book. It sets up who God is. It talks about his agency in creating the universe. It talks about who we are in relation to God. It talks about our ongoing relationship with our Creator, and it talks about the tension of rebellion against God and the resolution that will come out of it. And I'm going to take this opportunity to plug the Bible Project, which is a really, really great series. They do YouTube videos, they do podcasts, extremely informative on Old Testament how to read the Old Testament like the ancient Israelites. And so a lot of this talk is sourced from there. Highly recommended. All right, so why was the book of Genesis written? So Israel had just escaped from slavery in Egypt, just is used flexibly here. And who were the Israelites' neighbors? Well, we had Egypt to the west, and we had Babylon to the east. And what did the Israelites know of this God Yahweh? Almost nothing, right? So when Moses went to Pharaoh saying, Yahweh demands that we hold a festival in his honor out in the wilderness, Pharaoh said, who's that guy? I don't even know who that is, right? I've never heard this name before. So it's easy when you're reading the Bible to come in on it with the pre-knowledge, the foreknowledge of the whole Bible, right? Which they didn't have. And so so they actually didn't know a whole lot about Yahweh at that point. And so Genesis serves to establish who Yahweh is in a world that's dominated by paganism, right? With all of their neighbors, all these neighboring mythologies are pagan. Now then, what questions is Genesis designed to answer? So this is where it gets into like how would the Israelites have viewed the book of Genesis, right? So in particular, ancient cosmologies in this era were trying to answer questions like who is God and what is his relationship with his creation, right? So they had, in my opinion, more important things on their mind than whether Genesis represents 7 literal days or whether Genesis was 7 long periods of time, right? They wanted to know the philosophical questions. They want to answer the philosophical questions about who are we and why are we here, right? But those are still important questions, don't get me wrong. It's just Genesis was specifically written to address the questions of who is Yahweh and who are we in relation to Yahweh, right? So the way I think about this is, married couples know that, matter of fact, Alan did it to us earlier. When somebody asks you, how did you meet each other, right? There's this moment where you for married couples, you look at each other and you're like, who's going to tell the story, right? You should tell it because you tell it better than I do. And they talk about how they met. One person saw the other one across the room and they knew that that was a really cute person, right? And then they started dating and they knew they were going to get married, right? And that whole lovey-dovey scenario, right? And the reason that makes sense is because they're telling it from their perspective, right? They're telling it. The idea is that if you went back and you videotaped their entire relationship leading up to that point, it probably you may not come away from the relationship with exactly the same perception as what they described, right? You'd be like, there's a lot more time here than what you're talking about, and this date that you said was really fun. It didn't look really fun when I was looking at it, right? And the point is because the question that you asked wasn't what was the series of events that culminated in you getting married. What you asked was how did your relationship blossom into a marriage, right? And so they're not giving you a factual representation, they're giving you the purpose and the feeling that went into their relationship, right? So similarly, Genesis isn't answering the question of what is the sequence of events that culminated in what we see today. It's answering the question of who are we? Where did we come from? What is our purpose? Question?
Oh, no. That's fine.
Okay, that's okay. We'll come back at the end for more questions. All right, onward and upward. So we're going to go on an adventure here, and the idea is that we're stepping into a culture that is distant to ours, both in space and in time, right? Because it's from the other side of the world, which already makes it weird enough. And it's also from thousands of years ago, which makes it doubly weird enough, right? So the idea is let's not, take your fanny packs off, and we'll be good tourists there. We're gonna try to view the culture like they view the culture, right? Try the local food, that kind of thing, and then we're not gonna be like the loud tourists who yell at them slowly in English like they're gonna understand it better, right? So the idea is that we want to kind of as we're reading this ancient text, we want to leave behind our presuppositions that we get from modern day culture. All right. So now we'll talk a little bit more about Israel's history. In particular, you can see that if this is the promised land-ish, then you can see Egypt is their neighbor to the west, Babylon is their neighbor to the east, right? So the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, is written by Moses. And so at this point, Israel is freed from Egypt. They're wandering in the desert, and they're steeped in pagan culture. Yeah.
I'm not personally. I kind of just an interview. I kind of find the whole Moses himself wrote the Pentateuch to be a little bit dubious. I do think that it was written earlier than many modern scholars believe it was, but I don't think Moses himself wrote it. One of the reasons being that Moses refers to himself is referred to in the third person, and the Pentateuch depicts Moses dying.
Yeah. So I won't spend too long on that particular topic. There are some books of the Pentateuch, not all of them, but some of them that specifically name Moses as the author, I believe. But I'm sure that there was some rounding of the edges by the people who kept the records, right, to be able to include Moses's death. That's neither here nor there, though. But the idea is that it was written in a period when Israel was wandering the desert post-Exodus. To give you an idea of what the common mythology was of the day, what did they believe about cosmology back in the Israelites' time? The typical belief was that the land is a flat disk, typically centered on whatever your favorite city of choice is. So the Babylonian map would have Babylon at the middle, and everything outside of that is no man's land, right? The land is founded upon the sea by the pillars of the earth. So you'll see that as a common theme in the Bible of there being literal pillars of earth. That's not just flowery imagery. That's a real thing that people believed back then. The sky is a dome, and there are waters above and waters below, right? If you dug down far enough, you're going to get water. Just like there's a reason why when you dig down, you find wells, you get water. It's because there's water under the earth, right? These are the sorts of things that they would have believed back then. This was their understood mythology from 1500 BCE. All right. So what's the difference? All right, so just to emphasize, they're less concerned about what exactly happened, and they're more concerned with the meaning behind why things happened. So in particular, we're experiencing a conflict of ontology, which is probably not a word that you expected to hear in this particular talk. But ontology being the study of what it means to exist, right? So our concept from our culture of what it means to exist is material existence, right? It exists or it doesn't. But their idea of what it means to exist is having purpose and order or not having purpose and order. And I'll show you why that's the case here in a minute. But just in case you don't believe me about it, this is a quote from Dr. William Brown, professor of Old Testament at Columbia University, where he says, "The framers of creation in the Bible inherited a treasure trove of venerable traditions from their cultural neighbors. Instead of creating their accounts ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing," another Latin phrase you might not have expected, well, actually probably an astronomy talk, "the composers of scripture developed their traditions in dialogue with the great religious traditions of the surrounding cultures, particularly those originating from Mesopotamia and Egypt, as well as other more immediate Canaanite neighbors." So the point is that the story in Genesis is actually deliberately couched in a way that makes sense in light of the other cosmologies and mythologies surrounding Israel at the time. So, and we'll talk about that in detail here. So for Egyptian cosmology, we kind of learn about it from things like the Book of the Dead and the coffin texts. Coffin texts are literally hieroglyphs on coffins. They're organized into what is called spells. It has all sorts of things like literal spells in it, but also bits of cosmology and mythology, bits of burial rites, things like that. All sorts of different things written on the coffin texts. All of these cosmologies and mythologies are going to vary somewhat from source to source, so don't take this as gospel, but this is a general representation of what they believe. So in particular, see if you can spot the similarities with Genesis, and even more importantly, see if you can spot the differences. All right, so this is from spell number 714, translated by Alan, but not that Alan, in 2003. I am the waters, unique, without second. Just as a heads up, there's a break here, a different narrator. That is where I evolved on the great occasion of my floating that happened to me. This is weird sounding because it's translated from hieroglyphics. Bear with me. I am the one who once evolved, circlet who is in his egg. I am the one who began therein in the waters. See, the flood is subtracted from me. I am the remainder. I made my body evolve through my own effectiveness. I am the one who made me. I built myself as I wished, according to my heart. All right? So what are the similarities we see here? It starts from water. There's a flood, some talk of a flood. But what are the differences that we see with Genesis? Well, first of all, this is, to be specific, this is the creation story of Atum, who is the primordial Egyptian god that created all the other gods. You'll notice that he's actually born out of the waters. It actually specifically says that he created himself, right? Exactly as he wanted to be. So, so he did not exist before creation. He just created himself, poof, out of nothing, right? So the Egyptian cosmology, if we lay it out, you'll actually see these images when people talk about it. The pre-creation state is endless water. Crazy, right? Water represents life in a desert culture, obviously, for a culture like Egypt that lives on the Nile. And Atum, who is the primordial mound of land that rises out of the water, creates himself, literally born out of an egg. And then he births all of these other gods like Geb, who's shown here lying down, that's the land. Nut, who is shown here standing up, that's the sky. And, Nut is this one arching across. And then Shu is the air. And you can see here how we have that same common mythology. There's a flat ground with a dome over the top that holds back the sky. That same sort of thing with with what I was talking about earlier. All right, so what are the implications of an Egyptian cosmology? Well, the cosmos is self-generating. There is no uncaused cause that's philosophized about by the Greeks. Before the cosmos, there was nothing. And this is actually a really important concept. The water doesn't represent something, it represents nothing. And that's the place where we have to leave behind our concept of ontology. The uncreated, the decreated state is this chaotic sea. And the reason is because creation to them means giving it purpose and giving it order. So this is complete disorder and chaos, right? Is that a question?
Yeah, but you can keep going.
Okay, let me get to the bottom of the slide and then I'll let you ask it. So this is basically pure potential and no realization to them. Ra maintains order in the universe. You'll sometimes see him as riding a boat across Nut, who is the sky. And he is born every morning and he dies every evening and is swallowed by Nut and gets birthed out again the next day. And so he ordains when it's day and night. He is the one who sets the gods to all of their jobs of maintaining the universe. And he rises every morning to literally beat back the chaos that wants to overcome order. So every morning, he's depicted as he emerges in the morning as being attacked by jackals and snakes and things like that. And he's literally beating them away with a spear, right? So, there's this concept that he is the one who keeps the chaos at bay, right? Go ahead.
You mentioned that it was like, so the Greeks obviously popularized the idea of an uncaused cause, but as far as I'm aware, this isn't an idea unique to the Greeks. Obviously, I have no objective proof to say that this was an idea persisting in all cultures, but I feel like it could be something thought of by your average, it could exist in other cultures at the same time, we just probably don't know about it.
Sure.
But so if somebody could realize that everything that exists has a cause in cultures like, ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, because nothing special about the Greeks, right? They're just popular for it. But so if you're an Egyptian and you realize that there's no such thing as an uncaused cause,
right?
Would this be another way to kind of justify it to yourself in your mind as like, you don't really need an uncaused cause because your purpose is not to try to generate causes, your purpose is to try to generate order in the world you see around you.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. So you can't take it too literally, right? But this will be important because of how different Genesis is, right? So we're going to skipping ahead a little bit, but obviously when you read Genesis 1 and 2, we start out with the waters, and God doesn't emerge out of the waters, right? He's not born out of chaos or out of potential. He just exists, right? That's completely flying in the face of these other mythologies that existed at the time. And so just like with an inside joke where we understand more from the cosmology, the fact that basically all of the mythologies at the time had this initial primordial being self-creating out of chaos, it makes Genesis stand apart from them. Does that make sense?
The only thing being that makes it stand apart is that this particular being we call God existed before, or like before creation itself.
Yes.
The spirit of
exactly.
God was hovering over the waters.
Yeah.
Right.
It didn't come out from the waters.
Yes, so there's a concept of before anything existed and was ordered and had purpose, there was already God in place in Genesis. Whereas here, they just kind of self-create and start putting things in order, right?
Okay.
Yeah. You have a question?
Is self-creating, like, I don't know, that almost seems kind of similar to uncaused cause. I don't understand how it works, but.
Well, so that's a good point. So the uncaused cause that they're talking about here, or that I'm talking about here, is like the concept that this is kind of getting into the Kalam argument, like everything that it begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, right? But that's an argument for a creating being. So the point here is that God was not created by himself. He's just existed always. Whereas here, Atum created himself, right? So it's he has a cause, but he ascribes himself being the cause, right? So which doesn't make a whole lot of sense philosophically, right? But that's just how they describe him.
Chicken or the literal.
Yeah.
I think the best way to sort of to make sense of the idea of a thing causing itself is by thinking of like in hypothetical time travel. There's this thing called
Like a paradox or
the
something?
bootstrap paradox. Right?
Yeah.
Like, let's say future me emerges out of his time machine to tell me how to build a time machine, and so I build the time machine and then go and then use the time machine to be that future me that goes back in time to tell me how to build the time machine.
Yeah, I don't know. That's Egyptian sci-fi.
That's
but,
that's the best way. Like it's like the time machine sort of caused itself there.
yeah, it's kind of hard to envision, right?
That's the best way.
It's kind of a good argument against time travel. It leads to incoherency.
So keeping going, now we're going to talk about Babylonian cosmology, and it's important to note that they borrow from Sumeria heavily. So Sumerian cosmology, you had this whole pantheon of gods that come along, and then in Babylonian cosmology, they kind of just built on top of what already existed. So in the beginning, you have fresh water, Apsu, and salt water, Tiamat. So if anybody's a big Dungeons and Dragons fan, there you go, Tiamat. Gods are birthed against their will, against the will of Apsu and Tiamat. It's just by their mingling of the waters that the gods just kind of are born. And by the way, when I say this is Apsu and Tiamat, those are the names of the waters. Those are not gods. So those are like, that is the chaotic water, is the mixing of fresh water and salt water, Apsu and Tiamat. So the gods exist in this hierarchy of upper class gods known as Anunnaki, and a lower class of gods called the Igigi. And this reflects Babylonian culture. So in the Babylonian day, the upper class priests and nobility were considered to be avatars of the gods. And so this becomes important because the Igigi, those are all the gods that are in charge of things like dirt and air and stuff like that, like the universe. And they get tired of working and maintaining the universe, and they basically stage a strike. And the Anunnaki agree that they're going to make automatons or humans to serve as slaves. So what is the purpose of humanity? It's to serve as slaves to the gods, because the gods are tired. Who are the gods? The Babylonian nobility, right? Your word exists, you exist only to serve the nobility.
Obviously, they're aliens.
Very convenient.
That's like Stargate, right? All right, so here, some some Sumerian cosmologies, just as a quick note, Sumeria is kind of in the desert it has the Arabian desert nearby with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right? And the rivers would flood, and that would give them their agricultural cycles. But they actually describe the uncreated state sometimes as a desert, or as a desert where water comes, and that's where creation begins. Or sometimes they even describe it as there are already humans and plants and things like that, but the humans are walking around on all fours and eating grass and things like that because they have no purpose, they have no order, they're like animals, right? So that literally is the way that it's described. That's the uncreated state in Sumerian cosmology, is literally when people have no civilization, no organization, no purpose, right? Yeah.
When you said that, it occurred to me that in the book of Daniel,
Yes.
doesn't King Nebuchadnezzar get reduced to a
You're gonna see-
walking on all fours?
Once you start
Oh,
looking at this, you're going to start seeing all of these connections, right? It's literally a connection where Daniel knows about this sort of cosmology, and he's talking about how Nebuchadnezzar is reduced to an uncreated state. He's like an animal again, right? So you're going to start seeing these connections everywhere as we start talking about them. All right, so. The gods decide that humans are loud and smelly and they breathe like rabbits. So, literally, yeah. So the gods beg Enlil, who is one of the primordial gods, to flood and kill all of the humans. Enki doesn't like this. He warns a man named Atrahasis to make an ark for a 7-day flood. And Atrahasis uses birds to find dry land. He loads all of his animals and his family up in the boat. He lives. The gods end up killing Apsu, or freshwater, which enrages Tiamat. Tiamat becomes this enormous water dragon. She has a chimeric army, meaning they have all sorts of different body parts, like scorpions and men and bulls, and she's going to destroy everything. And the gods choose this young upstart god named Marduk as their champion. Who is Marduk? The patron god of Babylon. Marduk defeats Tiamat in this really epic story where he rides out to meet Tiamat and her army. He has a big net to catch Tiamat because for some reason it makes sense to use a net to catch the water. And he throws the net over Tiamat, and when he brings her in close, she opens her mouth to eat him, and he forces the 4 winds down her throat to open her mouth even wider, and he throws his spear in there and kills her. All right, so then what happens? Marduk splits Tiamat to form the ground and the sky. So creation has already happened at this point, but now Marduk takes over, and he now recreates the ground and the sky. Why? Because Babylon has taken over the region that Sumeria formerly inhabited, and they are now the ones who uphold order in the land. So where you might talk about how Sumeria collapsed because of political strife and all sorts of detailed words, this is how their culture would describe the fall of Sumeria and the rise of Babylon, right? All right. So what are the implications? Again, the universe is self-creating, right? You start out with mixing waters, and the gods just are born out of that, right? Enlil was the chief primordial god before Marduk, and it abstracts this rise to power of the Babylonian Empire. Marduk reestablishes the universe. He is the one who beat back Tiamat. He is the one who keeps chaos at bay. He gives order to the universe. He literally beats nature into subservience, right? Humans are annoying slaves. They live under constant fear of angering the gods and being flooded, right? So every year the rivers flood, and that brings you life. If they flood too much, it's because you angered the gods and they wanted to kill you, right? The Babylonian nobility are avatars of the gods, and all humans live to serve them. All right.
All these are obviously aliens.
Yes. So now we've come full circle, and we're finally back to biblical cosmology. All right. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This sets up that this is a creation story where God is at the center, right? And it prefaces what's about to happen. The earth was a formless and desolate emptiness. Note that this is not the globe earth, not the capital E earth. This is like dirt earth, right? The land. It means the land was formless and desolate emptiness. In the ancient Hebrew, this is literally the phrase tohu vavohu. It rhymes. It literally means the land is wild and waste. It's indicating that the land has no order and it has no purpose, right? The darkness was over the surface of the deep. Here, the deep is the word tahom, which you might recognize as being strangely similar to something like Tiamat, right? All of these languages have similar roots. And so this is the word for like the abyss, the deep abyss, like that water that's underneath the earth. It represents pure chaos, pure disorder, a pure decreated state. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. So hold on, just like we said earlier, God doesn't rise out of the water. He's not born out of the water. He's already there, right? So before creation, God already existed. Additionally, the word for water here is now mayim, which is neutral water. This is like water that you get from the sink or water from a spring, right? It's no longer the abyss, the chaotic, terrifying water. It's now just water. So just the fact that God is now hovering over the abyss turns it into normal, life-giving water, right? So this is stuff you don't get unless you are able to understand that Hebrew perspective, right? The Israelite perspective. All right, so now if we summarize Genesis, you'll see that day 1, we create light. Day 2 divides the waters above from the waters below. Day 3, dry land is created. Day 4, heavenly lights, things like the sun and the moon. Day 5 is birds and fish. Day 6 is livestock and humans. And day 7 is particularly special because it's the post-creation state. So for every single one of these days, it says, and there was evening and there was morning, the Xth day, right? And God saw that it was good. So except for day 7, there is no evening and there is no morning. Where are we? We're in day 7, right? So figuratively, I'm not saying that I'm not trying to make a statement on old and young Earth, right? This is from a literary perspective, we are in the 7th day right now. So we're in this state where we're in this state where God is meant to inhabit creation with the created, right? The 7th day is when he rests and he just enjoys it, right? Additionally, on day 6, when the humans are created, he doesn't just say that it's good, he says it is very good, right? So the humans aren't the smelly, wasteful things in Babylonian mythology. The humans are the prized creation of God, right? Now, moving on to Genesis 2, after we've gone through all the days of creation, we see that it says, now no shrub of the field was yet on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. But then God formed the man, right? But if we go back, we have all of the plants. Actually, I don't have plants on here, but the plants are formed with the land. The plants are supposed to come before the humans. What's up with that? Well, we know what's up with this now. This is exactly like the Sumerian cosmology, right? It's starting over the story in Genesis 2, and now the decreated state is no longer the waters. The decreated state is the land with no cultivation, with no order, with no purpose. And it specifically mentions because there was no man to cultivate the ground, right? So there was no civilization, and then God creates man. So it starts over the creation story because now we're no longer talking about how the universe came into being and what God's relationship is with all of the created things. We're specifically talking about his relationship with humans, right? And so now we're going to have a separate creation story that specifically addresses how he's in contact with humans. So that's why you end up with these weird discrepancies in Genesis, where things are out of order between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's because this is just a different version of the uncreated state that it's talking about here, right? It doesn't mean there was literally water or that there was literally land or whatever. It means that there was uncreation and then there was man. God formed man out of the dirt. All right. So it's riffing on all of these motifs that you find in all of these other cosmologies, all these other mythologies of the day. And this would have made total sense to the Israelites, but it's hard for us to put ourselves in that brain space. Now, where am I on time? Oh, we're bad. All right. So this is just a summary table that kind of summarizes all of those themes that we've talked about, right? Where God self-create or spontaneously exists, but God exists apart from creation. Creation is a constant struggle against chaos, but God speaks in creation and instantly obeys. That's completely different from all of the other cosmologies. Mankind acts as slaves to the gods, but mankind is God's prized possession in the Bible. And then finally, when God sends the flood, it's to cleanse violence and chaos from the land, not because he's annoyed and just is like tired of the humans, right? All right. So just to give you an idea, if we carry this forward, we have things like the snake in the garden is just like Apep, the enemy of light, the giant serpent in Egyptian cosmology, literally the embodiment of chaos in Egyptian cosmology. Things like like I said, I'm not trying to say that these are like the Genesis account didn't literally happen, because it very well may have, but just that there's a blending of literal truth with thematic truth, right? The plagues against Egypt, that's Egypt being reduced to a decreation state. The water turns into blood, the liquids are no longer behaving like they're supposed to, right? Frogs crawl out of the water. Those are creatures that live in both the land and the water, which in Genesis, all the creatures are separated into land creatures and water creatures, right? They create gnats out of the dust. What was created out of the dust? We were created out of the dust. What are gnats? They stick around dead things, right? Literally, it's a symbol of death being created out of the dust. Darkness descends, no more light, and then finally death for the firstborn. So it's an inverse of all the things that happen in Genesis. It's this decreation process as all of these plagues are sent against Egypt. Yeah.
Don't they also say that all of the plagues against Egypt were pointed at various Egyptian gods?
Yes.
That were like, oh, there's the god of the livestock and that, whatever. Right?
Yes, that is exactly right, and that could be a presentation by itself.
Okay.
All right, and then literally, God splits the sea for the Israelites to escape the Egyptians. He splits the water again, right? Literally. And the Egyptians are swallowed by the water, the chaos. He wields the chaos, right? He's the creator. So, and then we have the image of Jesus calming the storm. Literally, the stormy waters, he calms them, right? These themes go all the way through the Bible, and the writers know it. So, so keep it in mind as you read. All right, modern cosmology. Congratulations, we've made it through all of the history. Now we get to talk about astronomy, which is nominally why you came here. All right, so the pre-Hubble universe. This is actually really fun. This is a print from the 1850s that I actually have hanging up in my house. This is not my image. I just found this online. My parents got me this poster an original copy of this when I graduated with my PhD. Super neat. But what you'll notice is that in particular, there's something missing up here, which is it doesn't talk about any galaxies. And the reason for that is because at the time, we didn't know that there were other galaxies other than Milky Way. And in particular, you'll see this right here. I meant to tell you at the beginning of the presentation to pay attention to the first slide, because this galaxy is on the first slide. And you'll see here, it's called the Great Spiral Nebula, because a nebula in astronomy is a cloud of gas, or if you think about it literally in terms of the roots of the word nebula, it's some nebulous thing, right? It's something we don't understand. And so we had all these blobs of light that we saw in the sky, and galaxies were some of those blobs, like the Great Spiral Nebula. That was the state of our understanding of cosmology before Hubble. This was the steady state universe. This universe has just been around forever. And it just exists as is. It's always been like this, right? Dr. Edwin Hubble revolutionized the field. So he noticed a Cepheid variable star in the Andromeda Nebula, now the Andromeda Galaxy. And we knew that the Milky Way was about 100,000 light years across. And this detection was several 100,000 light years away. So this was a critical point at which we finally discovered something was outside the Milky Way, like very far outside the Milky Way. So he was the first person to actually prove that the Andromeda Nebula was not inside the Milky Way, and that it had its own body of stars and that whole business. So this is the actual plate that he recorded his observations on. You'll see there's this star that's highlighted by a line, and it says VAR! Exclamation point. So that is the variable star that he identified in the Andromeda Galaxy. And then now you can see what it looks like with the Hubble Space Telescope. Much better, right?
Yeah.
Very easy to see now. But at that time, completely unheard of. So his 1929 paper, around here somewhere, there it is, His 1929 paper also showed that there was a relationship between how far away a galaxy is and how fast it's moving away from us. So that's what's being shown here. On the x-axis, we have parsecs, which is a unit of distance in astronomy. In particular, it's 10 to the 6 parsecs, so it's megaparsecs. On the y-axis, we have velocity in kilometers. There should be a per second here. He was a little sloppy with his units. And you can see this linear relationship that he found between how far away a galaxy is and how fast it's receding from us. So what does this tell us? Well, if you run time backwards, everything compresses down, right, to a point. And so this was incontrovertible proof that the universe must have had a beginning, right? It's not just sitting there with everything out there in space. Everything is moving away from us, which means that we can back up time to where it was actually really, really close together. Around the same time, Einstein was developing his general theory of relativity, in which he posited that space and time are not actually separate things, they're one thing, right? That they're all one unit called space-time. And he actually was influenced by this paper by Hubble, because he had recently come to similar conclusions with his work on the general theory of relativity, where he found that the universe had to be expanding, and he said that's not possible, and he fixed it by putting in a fudge factor. And that fudge factor is now basically what we use today to model dark energy in the universe. So, which is this expanding force in the universe. So this kind of builds into the Kalam cosmological argument that we talked about earlier, that's popularized by William Lane Craig in particular, which I feel like we should have a picture of him up on a group like this. But but everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe has a cause, and so therefore, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, right? So this was the first time that we could actually concretely say the universe began to exist. To talk a little bit further about the expanding universe, so sometimes you'll see people, if people don't understand it well, you might think that we are at the center of the universe, right? Everything is flying away from us. So the universe exploded and we're at the middle, right? That's not true. So what I'm showing here is basically if each of these dots was a galaxy, and the black dots represented the beginning state, and the red dots represented the ending state, if I keep one point on the same spot for both states, you can see how it actually looks if I just expand everything. It looks like everything is moving away from it, right? In reality, that's not the case. I could pick any dot on here and do the exact same thing as if I was from that perspective, right? And it would look like all of the galaxies were flying away. It's just a product of the fact that space is expanding. Everything is moving away from everything. It's not that everything is moving away from us. That's kind of an optical illusion. And you'll also see that for galaxies that are farther away, they've moved farther, right? Because if you stretch all of space uniformly, then things that start out farther away are going to be, if you double the distance, something that starts out farther away is going to be now twice as much farther away, right? So the velocity is greater as you get further away. This is kind of the image of the universe as we know it, this expanding universe. Coupled with this is redshift. So redshift is not too dissimilar from the Doppler shift applied to light. So just like how you have this Doppler shift where if a train or a motorcycle or something is coming towards you, it pitches up, and then as it passes you, it pitches down. It's like kind of thing, right? And so the exact same thing happens with light. When something is moving towards you at relativistic speeds, it gets bluer, the whole light spectrum shifts to shorter wavelengths. And then if it's moving away from you, the whole light spectrum shifts to redder wavelengths. So because there's a relationship between how far away a galaxy is and how fast it's moving, we basically, by measuring its redshift, the redshift of a galaxy, we can get a proxy for how far away that galaxy is, right? All right, so now we have the Big Bang model, which is kind of what has evolved, what's grown out of this theory that the universe was what's small and now big, right? And in particular, one thing that might bother you a little bit on here is inflation. I know that we've had some discussions about inflation before, and I'll talk about it in a little bit of detail. But this kind of gives you an idea of what this whole progression looks like. We have some initial beginning. We have the first stars forming about 400 million years later, and then we have the development of galaxies and things. And right here, this is going to be important, this afterglow pattern that happens between 300 and 400,000 years after the universe starts. This is the afterglow of the Big Bang, also called the cosmic microwave background radiation. One important thing to note is that sometimes there are misconceptions about the Big Bang theory where, especially for people who haven't looked at it in detail, they may think that it explains the beginning of the universe, which it does not. It's an explanation of how the universe evolved after its creation, right? If space and time began at the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang applies to everything after that, right? Physics applies to all the stuff after that. We can't apply physics to stuff before that, if you can even say there is a before that. So that's what we're looking at here. All right. The cosmic microwave background radiation is that afterglow that I talked about earlier. Essentially, this is the afterglow from when the universe was extremely dense, such that all of the energy was basically in radiation, right? No matter could form because it would immediately just get annihilated by photons. And eventually, as the universe gets bigger and bigger, it has a low enough density that photons aren't going to just smash into a particle and obliterate it, right? So the way you can think about it is that the universe started out being too hot and dense for basically anything meaningful, and then it was too hot and dense for particles, and then it was too hot and dense for atoms, and then it was too hot and dense for molecules, and then after that it became transparent, and now we can actually see long distances in the universe, right? And so this is the leftovers of the not transparent part of the universe. So this is a really good marker of the Big Bang, right? Because we can say, how much has the universe expanded since then? We should know exactly what the redshift of these photons are, and it matches perfectly with what we understand of the universe's expansion. Another big element of evidence for the Big Bang theory is Big Bang nucleosynthesis. So this is a big honking word that basically means that when the universe was very hot and very dense, it acted as a nuclear reactor. And so it was forming things like helium and lithium in the early universe just in space because it was that hot and that dense. And as it expanded, that got frozen in place at a certain level of density in the universe. And so we have observations from things like WMAP that give us measurements of some of these elements, and we can confirm that they are in the proper abundances, meaning that the universe was once a nuclear reactor because of the Big Bang, because it was very, very hot and very dense. All right. So the next thing is, why inflation? What's the big deal with inflation? Why do we need it at all? Well, the answer is, I lied to you. The last image of the cosmic microwave background was not the correct one. This is actually the correct one. And the previous one showed the variations in the cosmic microwave background, which are about 1 part in 10 to the 5th, but it's actually extremely uniform. So if I were to show it as a plot, it would just be a one-color plot, right? It doesn't work to assume that the universe is completely isotropic, right? So we saw, sorry, the word isotropic is a big $5 word that means that it's the same in all directions. So no matter what direction you look, it's basically similar if you look far enough. So why would the cosmic microwave background be not be perfectly isotropic, right? What if you had all of the matter in the universe and you just boom expanded it, right? It should all be perfectly spread out, possibly, maybe, if that's what your initial conditions look like. Why is it not perfectly spread out? On the other hand, why is it almost perfectly spread out, right? Like, it isn't perfectly spread out, but it doesn't have very many variations either. And the key point here is that opposite sides of the universe should never be in contact. So if I look all the way that way, as far as it goes, I can see 13 billion years into the universe's past, right? And it's taken all of that time for that light to reach me. If I look that way, same deal. But these two spots can never talk to each other because the light has just reached me in the middle from those two spots, right? So why are they the same temperature? Like that's a bizarre question for a physicist. Like they must have had some time to mix or something like that so that we could homogenize everything out and make it all uniform. Why don't you have these wild variations in temperature from one side of the universe to the other, right? Because they should never have been able to equalize with one another and come into equilibrium. So the answer, or a simple answer to that question, is the theory of inflation. So I want to preface this by saying this is not a confirmed theory. This is just a suspiciously good answer. So this is a suspiciously elegant solution to these and some other problems in astronomy, but it's not confirmed. So the question essentially is basically, what if the early universe was actually dominated in energy by something other than matter and radiation, right? What if that was not the dominant source of energy in the universe, but there was some other field that we don't know about? Then this would if this field had the right properties, meaning that it had what's called a false vacuum, that it would it could actually cause the universe to expand exponentially, very, very quickly, by about 60 e-folds. So for you mathy people, that's e to the 60th times in about 10 to the minus 34 seconds. So this is like ridiculous levels of expansion. And by ridiculous, I mean like if that happened today, you wouldn't even know that it happened and you wouldn't exist anymore, right? Like all of your atoms get blown apart. So what we're thinking here is with the theory of inflation is if a scalar field such as this existed, then you could actually have a region of equilibrium that started out very small and was able to kind of equilibrate all of the temperatures and things like that. And then it also gets, boom, blown up. And now the same size region, the same size circle that you would look at is actually a very small part of the sky, right? So it basically gives the universe some time to mix and commingle and equal out all the temperatures, and then boom, everything expands really, really fast, and now these two parts can never talk to each other again, but they had some time at the beginning to commingle and iron out all the differences, right? I'm not gonna go there yet. So the other thing this solves that's very handy is the question of, well, why is the universe not perfectly isotropic, right? And the answer there would be that if there are quantum fluctuations and it expands that much, e to the 60th in 10 to the minus 34 seconds, all those quantum fluctuations get blown up into macro scale fluctuations in the background. And so at that point, you now have tiny little inhomogeneities or anisotropies. These are directions that are not quite the same as everything else, right? Because of this static that gets blown up from the quantum level up. And now you have little seeds of slightly more or slightly less dense regions in the universe that now can form galaxies and stars and things like that. You don't end up with a case where everything is perfectly uniformly distributed and nothing can gravitate anywhere, right? Yes?
So why not just us? So why do we need to give things time to like equilibrate? Why not assume that it's in some that it was in some equilibrium or close to equilibrium at just the initial conditions?
Because, that's a good question. So that has to do with fine tuning. So otherwise you have to assume that the universe was just really, really, really well fine tuned at its creation, right? And which is no problem at all for a
theist.
Yeah, a theist, right? And it's kind of a big problem for someone who's trying to explain something with a natural phenomenon, right? So the point is, there is a natural phenomenon that could explain this. It's not confirmed, but I'm personally not too worried about this. There's lots of other elements of the Entropic Principle that we can point at. Then we don't have to have inflation, right? But this is something that suspiciously solves all of those problems. But like I said, we have not confirmed.
You still need some fine tuning with inflation.
Yes.
I don't
Yeah,
know if
even
you're
with
gonna get into
inflation,
that
you
or
need
not,
fine
but-
tuning. It
Yeah.
kind of pushes the button.
It might help
but-
some, but yeah, you
Yes.
still have some big issues.
Yeah. So yeah. And this kind of leads into the Entropic Principle, which is what I was mentioning before, and kind of what Alan is alluding to, which is basically that the universe is uniquely designed with laws that benefit life. So there's some amount of fine tuning that had to go into the universe for us to get anything that could possibly host life, right? And I'm not good at quoting all statistics here. But there's just a ridiculous number of constants in the universe that had to be very, very finely tuned for things to work out. In particular, this is one of my favorites, which is that the number of time and space dimensions allows for stability. So we are right here. Oh no. Okay. So you can't see the x and y axes. This is the number of space dimensions, and this is the number of time dimensions. So we have 1 time dimension and 3 space dimensions. This would be 0, 0. So, so the idea here is that if you had more than 3 spatial dimensions, you can't have any stable gravitational orbits. So there is no gravitational orbit at all. You can't have planets around stars. You can't have stars around galaxies. None of that works with 4 spatial dimensions. Yeah.
2 questions that are inevitably the same.
Okay.
One, why can't you have gravitational forces in a multiple dimension universe? And number 2, how in the world did they get this information?
So that is because gravity is not a classical force. So forces like the electromagnetic force come from they come from fields, and like the electromagnetic field. Gravity does not come from a gravity is a product of curved space-time, basically. So the general theory of relativity talks about how space-time curves and bends and warps in the presence of energy. And so you can actually use just the curvature of space and time to entirely account for the force of gravity through general relativity, in which case it doesn't behave like the electromagnetic force and things like that. And that means that just based on the number of spatial dimensions, you can actually work out the math problem to figure out what the forces look like. And in particular, the really weird one is that if you go to the left, meaning there are less than 3 spatial dimensions, there is no gravity. There's no gravity allowed with general relativity if you have fewer than 3 dimensions. So no gravity left and no gravity to the right. Yeah.
Also, not to mention the fact that 3 spatial dimensions makes it possible to have cross products of vectors. Also another weird quirk.
Well, we have cross products of vectors now.
Well, are you meaning like curl, the fact that curl couldn't exist in a higher?
Curl can exist in 4 dimensions. Or
Oh, yes.
Basically because of the Pascal's triangle 1, 3, 3,
Yeah,
1,
right.
the fact that those 3s are the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cross products couldn't exist.
Yes, sir.
One thing that might kind of answer Yabus's question a little bit is there's a result or theorem in math that it's a drunk man almost always finds his way home, but a drunk bird never will. And it's if you just stumble in random directions in 2 dimensions, you are nearly certain to reach your origin point. But if you do the same thing in 3 dimensions, it's almost impossible. Like the probability is near 0 compared to near 100%. So some of these things can be calculated. That's probably kind of similar.
It's harder to have a digestive system in 2D, for example.
Well, that's another point, right? If you tried to create complex life in lower dimensions, you also run into topology problems, right? Where there's too much, it requires too much topological complexity, right, to create life. Yeah.
And there's also with regards to the forces thing, you could also make the argument that you could also make an argument from Gauss's law. That in 4 dimensions, Gauss's law would produce an inverse cube rule.
Yeah, all of the forces start getting weird.
And in 2 dimensions, it produces just an inverse rule.
Yeah. So and then on the other hand, if you start going vertical, right, if you go up the time, you up the number of time dimensions, you can get really weird behavior where particles decay into higher mass particles, which is like a big no-no in physics. So the point of this isn't necessarily to say that this particular diagram is not necessarily to say that life could not exist in these other squares, but it would certainly look so different from what we understand that it would be basically unintelligible to us, right? And a simple example that I had also was that a proton and a neutron, if you flipped their masses, which their masses are like 938.5 mega electron volts per c squared and 939.2 mega electron volts per c squared. So by like a factor of 1 in 1,000, if you just flipped the masses of the 2 of them, there's no neutral hydrogen in the universe, because now you have an overabundance of neutrons and not protons, and there's no more hydrogen gas to stick around, and you don't get stars, you don't get us, all that stuff. So bad stuff. Okay. Oh, this one is really neat too. Fred Hoyle was able to predict a resonance of carbon based on the fact that there are carbon-based life forms on Earth. He said, there's got to be some process in stars that produce a bunch of extra carbon, and he found it just based on that. So that's not exactly the entropic principle, but it's related. All right, so let me wrap up because we're way over already. So Genesis showed us that God existed apart from creation, right? In contrast to all of these other mythologies. God is extremely precise. In fact, he provides all of the order to the universe, right? And we can see that he's extremely precise through things like the Entropic Principle and all of these wild and crazy physical laws that we have, right? Never mind the fact that they're extremely finely tuned, but just the fact that the universe works is a miracle, right? God created the universe for our enjoyment, right? He created the universe so that we could inhabit it with him. We're in the 7th day of creation now. What do we see? Our universe had a beginning, the Kalam Argument, right? Hubble tells us that the universe, if you were to run it backwards, it goes all the way back to the Big Bang. Our universe is extremely well ordered through things like the Entropic Principle. And then finally, it's a terrible minimum viable product. I didn't talk about this one so much, but it is one of my favorites, which is no multiverse for you. So, with things like the multiverse, the theory of multiverse is that you would expect that if our universe was produced by random chance, it should be like the size of a solar system, right? But it's not. It's ridiculously huge compared to that. So it's a way overdone minimum viable product. So it doesn't really make sense in light of something like a multiverse theory either. I'm going to leave this up as kind of like a summary of stuff that we've talked about. Thank you so much for your time and for staying late. And,
Actually, it's not that late. It's not
Okay.
late. It's not late. You're fine.
Get out of here at 8:30.
Okay, good.
Also, we
In
started
that
late
case, I
anyway.
have 15 more minutes. Just kidding. I'm happy to take any questions.
Could you go back to, or you just said you were going to keep this slide up, but could you go back to the one slide with all the dots? It was
Slide with the
where,
dots.
yeah.
Expanding universe.
Yep.
So you mentioned during this that you could basically go to any other point and do the exact same thing as you're doing with home in that one. Could you explain that a bit more?
Yes. So the idea is that all I'm doing here with this particular dot is I'm not moving it from start to end, right? Which is basically the equivalent of me saying, this is my spot now, and then I wait 10 seconds, I say, I'm still in the same spot, right? So any dot that I make the start and end point be the same is my dot, right? That's home. So for me, it might be this dot. For somebody else, it might be this dot, in which case, if I overlaid the red and black dots here, now this whole thing would shift and it would look like everything was spreading away from this point. And so, this is a product of the fact that the universe is expanding, is everything is moving away from everything, and so it makes it look like everything is moving away from you specifically, but in fact they're receding from, everything is moving apart from everything.
How did these big brain scientists figure out that that's what we were seeing and not just everything is moving away from us?
I'm gonna go with big brain scientists. That's a pretty good answer.
They probably assume there's no particular reason to assume we were at
Yes.
the center.
That's a critical assumption in science, is basically that you can't assume that you have any particular time or space has special privileges, right?
So this is the reason why we can't figure out like where the origin point is of the universe, because everything just looks like it's going away from each other anyway.
The more accurate statement would be that probably there is no origin point of the universe. So this is something that causes some consternation when people try to understand the Big Bang, which is it's hard to visualize. I've had people often ask me, well, what is the universe expanding into, right? Like there's like extra space or something, right? That's outside of the real space. But that's not the case. So the universe is, the Big Bang was not an explosion that happened at a location. It was an explosion that happened in all of space and time. And and space and time and space at least has become less and less dense over time as it kind of, expanding is such a poor word to describe it. The problem is that we're having, do you have a better way to phrase it?
I think I might, yeah.
Okay, go for it.
It's not like the Big Bang, like technically what we're dealing with is like, I'm not a GR expert, but technically what we are dealing with is a metric. And it's not galaxies are moving apart from each other. It's that space itself is increasing,
Yes.
right? Like, you can imagine that if you imagine space as a separate entity from objects in space, you can have two balls in space, and you can have, and then the distance between the balls are increasing, even though the balls aren't really, I guess, moving.
An illustration that they'll often use in physics classes is to like have like a balloon or something with a bunch of dots drawn on it. And then, so imagine your uninflated balloon with all of its dots, they're all like fairly close together because the balloon is still small. And you blow air into the balloon, the dots get farther apart. They're getting farther apart because it's the surface of the balloon that's expanding. And you're supposed to think of like the surface of the balloon as being an analog to space.
So that's why you can't really say there's nothing beyond the universe, in the sense that there's not like space and.
There's not
extra
more space, yeah.
But,
But the idea of space like multiplying and expanding is a good way to think about it. Because typically when density goes down, it's because we pulled something out of the system, right? You have some density of gas, you took some gas out, right? This is a case where you can think about it as the space expanding, or that you're just adding more space in, right? Yeah.
in that analogy though of the balloon, if the surface is what's analogous to our three-dimensional space, and that means the 2D of the 2D surface of the balloon is our 3D space. So wouldn't that mean the entire balloon, the entire universe then would be a 4D hyper object?
Yeah,
Maybe a sphere,
space-time.
maybe not.
That's
Okay.
the whole idea behind space-time, is that space-time
But-
is four-dimensional, not three-dimensional like we think about it to be.
But you're saying
Okay, but
even, I think you're
specifically
right,
with the
the,
time, but not a fourth spatial dimension.
Not a
Just
fourth spatial,
Simply the
yeah.
time dimension serves as
the
that.
balloon is good for people to
skin
understand, but
almost.
it's still more
There's
of
still
a
limitations.
Yeah.
1D off kind of thing, but yeah.
It could be the case though, like the balloon, where if you went a very, very long way in one
Yeah.
direction, that you could
Yeah, 'cause
actually end up where you
Honestly, I've
started.
always thought of the
Without
universe as some sort of hypersphere, but then again, I know we've done a lot of measurements trying to figure out the flatness of it, and it still looks very, very flat.
It
So.
could still be a hypertorus.
And the flatness of the universe is another big
or a
solution
very-
that inflation provides.
Or a very,
Yeah.
very big hypersphere.
Yeah, so the reason for that is inflation would essentially cause it to look extremely flat, even if it wasn't perfectly flat. Just like how if you blew up a sphere very, very large, how it starts to look very flat like the Earth, right? So,
I feel like I've heard the number like 250 thrown around as like that's how many times bigger the universe would have to be than our observable pocket in order for it to still appear flat with our measurements, I think.
oh, but still be
Yeah.
a closed universe, it has to be like at least 250 times as large.
Cosmological
So, that might not
constant.
be the exact number, but I feel like I've heard some kind of number
Sounds
thrown
good to
out as
me.
like, in order, because our measurements still have some kind of error to it, so it still might be
Yeah.
current.
Yeah.
I think the cosmological constant kind of throws off that whole discussion too, because then you're adding another force of expansion
Yeah.
to the whole question. But,
True, yeah, and then there's that whole question of what even that is, so.
yeah.
Yeah. Further questions? Yes.
Would you agree that the Babylonian creation myth is probably more interesting than the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
It would make for a sick movie, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's pretty cool. The images of Marduk are leave something to be desired, though. I mean, he's like, not super impressive looking, but in the stories, he like rides a literal storm cloud as a chariot.
Get some
So
animators in
that's
that.
pretty cool. Yeah,
Goku did that.
go ham.
What are your thoughts on the hypothesis that these beings in these cosmologies and
No.
mythologies
No.
Are aliens.
You told me to stop him.
I said maybe the more specific question is whether I think there's life other than on Earth in the universe. Is that a fair point?
Or is this a particular theory that there are aliens and this is how it got recorded because they seem like gods to them?
Because that's
To me, this seems so obvious, like they made it up to get the people to serve them, right? I mean, it doesn't
it's very
scream to
convenient.
some deeper alien explanations.
Oh, it is. That's not supposed to happen.
What's up?
The dude's hand is backwards.
His hand is not the right way.
I won't tell anybody. Some guy made a mistake 4,000 years ago, and he's like, no one will notice.
But we did.
Maybe,
No, that's just-
maybe he just has his hand like backwards like this.
Or maybe he's
I don't
just like, so,
Couldn't he just
No,
do
it's
that?
Well, it's
You
two
have
left
to head
hands.
your hands backwards. It doesn't.
he's a 2D figure guy.
Which hand are we having a problem with here?
Wait, no,
Left.
that's his nail.
Left, his
What are your
left hand.
thoughts then on the
Well, but
question of
he's
like people
facing-
trying
No,
to
no,
find
he's
life
facing this
somewhere in
way.
the universe?
If he's in-
Ah.
Because his thumb would be for the back if it was just like
Yeah,
this.
So that's a really big topic in
Yeah.
astronomy, and a lot of
Like-
a lot of astronomers like to believe that. I found from being in the field. I think the consensus for astronomers is that well, first of all, astronomers tend to be overwhelmingly atheist or agnostic, and so their perspective is basically, well, there's life on Earth, and you got ridiculous
That's pretty
statistics out there, so sure, there's got to be, right? My thought is that it would be I would be surprised, put it that way. The really cynical answer that I tell people is that it doesn't matter, and the reason for that is because our next closest star is several light years away. So us being able to beam a message them, if they responded immediately back, it would be like 5 to 6 years before we got a message back, right? So our ability to communicate with a civilization that's even a few stars away would be extremely limited, right? With our current understanding of physics. But the less cynical answer is that certainly if God created life in one place, he could do it again, right? I don't think that harms our understanding of biblical cosmology or who God is, right? But in terms of like a naturalistic sort of perspective, I don't even see it there, honestly, because there's so many. You do have a large statistical body, right? Because there's so many stars, so many galaxies, so many planets, right? But on the other hand, there's no accepted naturalistic mechanism for generating life from non-life, right? And so until you can quantify that statistic, it doesn't matter how many examples you have, right?
Yeah, I think there's good reasons for thinking it's dwarfed, even if you have
Exactly.
10 to the 22nd stars or whatever.
Yeah.
If you really study origin of life science, it seems
That's
far less probable than.
I mean, like, aren't the calculations of like Douglas Axe? I think like 10 to the 77.
That's just
of, like,
even to get
different-
like a protein.
Yeah, just to
Yeah.
get a
But I mean,
protein and
there-
putting
there's,
that
for
in
example,
context of even the stars. That's still a ridiculously
Yeah.
small chance.
Eugene Koonin
If you're
he's like
turning
a,
on
he was raised in the Soviet Union, an atheist origin of life researcher. And he thinks it's, he appeals to the multiverse just to get an origin of life because he doesn't think it's probable in this
Dang.
universe. So
Yeah. the
that's an
problem is-
example of.
The problem is when you're multiplying probabilities like that, because you're saying, what's the probability of you having a star that's hospitable to life? What's the probability of you having a planet that could potentially host life? What's the probability of it having the chemicals it needs, right? So if you have, like Alan said, 10 to the 22 stars in the whole universe, right? You don't actually need very many things to have small chances for that to become like a vanishingly small probability, right? Because 10 to the 22, all I need is 22 1 in 10 chances, and your expectation number becomes 1, right? So, and that's not hard to do when you're starting to think about like, well, what are the odds of this happening, right? What are the odds of this happening? What are the odds of having everything you need all in one location and stuff like that? And so, coming up with a single statistic that could beat 10 to the 22, that's hard to come up with, although, some people have proposed them. But when you look at a body of statistics that you would need to multiply this probability by this probability by this probability, you start to get vanishingly small numbers really fast. And so, from a probabilistic standpoint, I think it does not make sense. But I would say I'm probably.
There's more of a chance on theism than atheism, I think, because like you said, God could create other life, and
Yeah.
he's under no obligation to tell us about it. But.
Yeah. So like I said, I'm in the minority for astronomers on that one, but that's my
Yeah.
opinion for that.
Does anybody know the context for the dog joke? Is that?
No.
No.
So there's some aspect of Sumerian life that we no longer know about, and we know it's a joke, but we don't know what's funny about it. It's kind of like, if aliens, if aliens were observing our culture and someone sent somebody else something that said,
Lol XD.
if somebody else sent someone a joke that said a priest, a rabbi, and a pastor walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "What is this, a joke?" Right? We all know that's a joke, but somebody who has no cultural context, they have no idea what's funny about that, right? Like, so,
Is God outside of time?
We're not dealing with
No,
that
not
question
yet.
right
No.
now.
Not yet.
That's a joke, or
No.
what was that?
well, if you're gonna go by
No, that's an
the
in-joke.
themes
That's
here,
an in-joke.
then he's completely outside of creation, and therefore is outside of time.
That
So how does God have relations
No.
with his
No.
Hey,
No.
hey, this will be after the
I
official
guess they
thing,
have an
okay?
internal
that
debate
that's
going.
the whole time discussion.
Speaking of inside jokes, I think this is an inside joke. But yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
It's
Yeah.
also possible that we could understand the context of the Sumerian joke and not think it's funny. Just because
It could be a bad joke.
certain email chains or like Facebook groups or whatever, that it's like, I see why they think it's funny, but it's not.
That's a good point. I didn't actually think about that one.
Oh, we are at 8:30. We have hit the time.
All right.
So,
Well, like I said, I hope this was informative on Genesis. It probably wasn't quite as much astronomy as you were expecting, but I hope that it was a fresh way to look at the book of Genesis in a way that,
give me more questions than answers.
but
It
in a
was
way,
very
that
helpful.
helps you to understand it better, so that you can talk about it better with people who don't understand biblical cosmology in the book of Genesis. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
You are officially dismissed. If you want to go to Chick-fil-A, we leave at 15.
Go to the one on Campbell, not
One
the
in
one
Campbell.
on
Let's hear
Foster.
about some of that English history stuff.
I was
Very interesting.
honestly, I was worried that it was not going to be enough astronomy to
But he says, I'll
justify.
have